In today's episode, we'll answer some of our favorite questions from our listener community and celebrate this, our 100th episode.
Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. Ta-da! Well, another week, another podcast. Hi, Jesse. Here we are again. It's a special one, isn't it? I just said it. 100 episodes. Time has flown by. You're not looking a day older.
Why, thank you.
There we are.
Indeed.
It's been great fun so far. 100 episodes. Who would have thought when we started this whole project, when we just thought, you know what, let's just give it a go and see how it goes. And here we are, nearly 2 years later, I have to say. A bit of a milestone. There we go. There we are.
Yes, 100 podcast episodes about World War II. Slightly less long than 100 Years of Solitude, but still quite an achievement. I think it's been a lot of fun. You know, when we started this podcast with Battle Guide, nobody was sure if it would work out, how much interest there would be. Would it sort of be a sustainable project in practical terms? But thanks to all of you out there, listeners and viewers, we're still here and the show is going on. And so, I'm really happy that we've made it this far. I think the podcast has sort of taken root, if you will. Your feedback, viewers and listeners, has been overwhelmingly positive, and we're really happy when we get those kind of comments and messages with ideas or encouraging us or telling us what you like about the podcast or what we can improve about the podcast. And all that stuff has made it last for 100 episodes so far, I would like to point out. So far. So yeah, thanks to all of you out there. Thanks to the team at Battle Guide. Hunter, for example, who's doing all the cutting of the video. So when we mess something up, you guys don't get to see all of our mistakes. So thanks to Hunter and the others who edit, plus Linus behind the scenes, plus Dan from Battle Guide, and everybody else. Did I miss anyone, Matthias, or did that make sense?
Probably enough. And also, of course, it's not only our podcast, but we're now moving into different fields and areas as well, and having lots of fingers and lots of different pots and pies. So, for example, we are planning a battlefield tour to Berlin in the autumn to have a look at the fighting there. And we've just done a mini series on Berlin. We've also, together with the guys from our sister podcast, The First World War One, just finished a manuscript for a book looking at 12 of the decisive, the important battles of the World War. So you can see and hear, dear listeners and viewers, so we are there, we're building the empire, we're taking over. That's it.
Now, when a German starts talking about empires and taking over, things have gone too far. No, right. If you are interested in the book or in the battlefield tour in September in Berlin with us, you can check out some of the links that will be in the description below this video. So that was it for our big 100th anniversary celebration. Cue fake applause sounds here, I guess, on the soundtrack. Otherwise, today's episode is special for another reason, and that's because we decided once again to answer some of your questions. Some of our supporters in the podcast, if you want to support us, by the way, you can also go to our website, check that out. Some of our supporters sent us questions, and we picked a few that we would like to answer today. Shall I start, Matthias? Are we ready?
Off you
for
go.
The question and answer period. Okay, so these touch any and all aspects of the war. From John, we have a question from John. Hello, John, and thank you for supporting the podcast. Could you shed light on why the German army didn't have winter equipment their first winter in the Soviet Union? I get that they didn't prioritize it early on, but by October, November, December, why was this still not happening? Why were they stuck there in December without enough winter clothes? Take it away, Matthias.
Yeah, it's a very, very good question, a fair one. And of course, you can see the consequences of this German policy or oversight, whatever you want to call it, in the winter battles of 1941. And as John has said, well, there's quite some time, isn't there? So you've got several months to sort this out, and they simply don't do it. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. Well, maybe let's start with the the bigger picture stuff and the strategy behind this. I mean, why don't the Germans have winter equipment in the first place? I mean, you're going into Russia, for God's sake. You know it's going to get very, very cold in the wintertime. They do have their standard winter equipment, but that means reasonably thin coats. They're more made for somewhere in Germany rather than in deepest Russia. So that's a no-go anyway. And then, of course, the other point and problem that the guys are facing, the consequences they are suffering afterwards, is, of course, the German war plan. So when the Germans go into the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, they are quite sure that the Soviet Union will collapse within a few weeks. And they're not the only ones to think that. There are reports from, for example, the British defense attaché in Moscow when the Germans attack. He says, well, this is going to be over in a few weeks' time. He's packing his bags to get out of Moscow. I think this is not going to work. And of course, up to that point, the history of World War II and the Finnish Winter War had shown that, well, the Germans are extremely strong. They are able to defeat the French army, which was seen as the most impressive, the strongest army in Europe, capable army, probably apart from the Germans. And it takes them 6 weeks to defeat them. You've got the consequence of the lessons from the Finnish Winter War, where the Soviets get a very, very bloody nose. We talked about this in one of these episodes. So the expectation is you go in there, it will take 6 to 8 weeks' time, and the war is going to be over, and the Soviet Union will be defeated. So once that's achieved, you then pull out most of these troops to put them back into Germany, to put them somewhere else, because you will then still have to fight the war against Britain. That's still ongoing. So they'd already made all sorts of plans with regards to changing production, so no more tanks, which was causing problems later on, of course, but more planes, more U-boats, because this is where they think they're going from the autumn of 1941 onwards. The only enemy remaining is going to be Britain. So you don't need a lot of troops in the Soviet Union, and that means they don't need winter equipment. You're still going to need some people there who are going to occupy the territory and monitor the situation, all these things, an occupying force. So a number of divisions had some equipment, not many when you look at the normal Wehrmacht. When you look at the Waffen-SS, which of course in those days was still reasonably small, they tended to be better equipped. The simple reason for that being that these were the formations that were supposed to stay in the Soviet Union, occupy the territory, keep the Russians and the other nationalities down. And so that was the idea. Every now and then launch one of these big punitive expedition into the remaining part, the non-occupied part of the Soviet Union to the east. So they had that, not the others. And then the campaign happens, they fight the war, the Germans go into the Soviet Union, and in the end, well, they're not able to seize Moscow to bring the war to an end. Even before that, of course, everyone knows, well, you know what, this is a problem now. We need to change our way here because these guys are going to be in Russia for much, much longer, the Soviet Union, than we'd thought. And this then sets in motion a program in Germany, the Winterhilfswerk, so the winter support organization. And they're now beginning to collect civilian winter clothing, which they're then going to send to the front line. I mean, and that sends out so many warning signals. You can see that everything is quite wrong about this, because this is basically the regime admitting to the people that our plan didn't work. Of course, in good Goebbels propaganda, they try to put a very positive spin on this, but you can see it's difficult. And there are lots of newsreels and all these things where, for example, you've got women going to these collecting points and they hand over their winter coats, so female coats, and all these things are completely random stuff. Yes, you can turn that into some sort of positive propaganda message, but really it's sending out a very, very wrong sign. And then you've got this stuff, which to large degree needs to be changed and altered before you can hand it out to the troops. That again takes time. And then you've got the next problem. You're now collecting all this stuff, but it needs to get from Berlin all the way to somewhere in Moscow. That's a long, long, long way. The weather is bad. You've got a little bit of pattern activity, not too much, but generally speaking, that will already take quite some time to get all that stuff over there to the Eastern Front. And of course, it's not only about clothing. There are other things that need to be transported to the front line as well. The most important thing is always, of course, is food. You need to eat. You might say you can live off the land normally, but now it's winter, so you can't. So you need to be provided with food stuff. And of course, and this is the big one, ammunition. Whenever you look at any military campaign, you're looking at logistical issues and logistical resupply problems. the first thing that everybody will always concentrate on is ammunition, because that's the most important thing. The moment you run out of ammunition, you're done. Number 2 is food, and then everything else. So winter clothing comes under everything else. And that means that a lot of these troops get issued with some sort of winter clothing, as I said, sometimes even civilian coats, re-dyed or something like this, sometimes not even that, in the middle of winter or when the winter's already over. And that, of course, is the huge problem. And this is the reason why in the winter of 41 to 42, so many of the German, mainly German, some of the Axis troops as well, but mainly German troops are basically just freeze to death. This is why when you got the medal, the campaign medal that was awarded for the winter battle in the East, as it was called, well, that became known as the Order of the Frozen Flesh in the German military, because that was basically what it is. Fast forward to 1942 and onwards, that problem goes away. By that stage, they've learned a lesson. But this is the real underlying issue of all of this in 1941. So basically, extremely poor logistics based on a wrong strategic assumption. Now, that was one sentence on a very long blah I've just done, wasn't there? So I could just have in one sentence, but there we go.
Don't worry, folks. I went even deeper down the rabbit hole for this topic because I thought it's quite interesting. And of course, everyone knows they had this problem. But when you start sort of picking into a few details and maybe a few statistics, it becomes much clearer the extent of the problem. As far as the planning goes, I thought it was interesting. If you'd said in advance, when the planning for Barbarossa is going on, they're calculating, all right, well, how many trains is it going to take? How many tons of ammunition, et cetera, et cetera. If you said, yeah, so we're going to need enough transport for winter clothing for 3 million men. This is kind of a no-go. If you're the quartermaster general of the German army, Wagner, I think his name was, and you say that, it's like you're going against the whole plan. Everyone's going to look at you in the planning room and say, what do you mean? You don't think that our plan's going to work? And psychologically, you don't want to go into a plan assuming failure either. So if your plan is for a miraculous or a risky, quick victory, you're not going to have built in all these fail-safes necessarily. You're also not that keen to go and tell the political leadership, yes, I know that your political decision is that you expect the Soviet Union to collapse, but we want to prepare for 3 million men through the winter. It's just not going to go anywhere given the strategic assumptions that are being made, as you say. It's not like they didn't have any winter clothing in Germany at all. They had stocks of it. In fact, the quartermaster general, I saw a report or an excerpt from a report from early August saying, what we have, what's prepared for this occupying force, which was something like a third of what they went in with for the combat operations. It's ready to go in October. Problem is, when you get to October, you are in a situation that you don't expect. And you need to send all sorts of things. There are so many logistical difficulties. We could go on for this entire episode about logistical problems in the Soviet Union. But if you think about it, the rail gauge is different so that the tracks are wider. You need to either adjust all the wheels on your wagons, or you need different wagons. You need different locomotives. Many of those locomotives and other parts of trains have been destroyed in the fighting, or the Soviets have moved them east. So you have a shortage that can use that rail network in the Soviet Union. Okay, maybe you say, well, we also have trucks. But the German motor fleet is in not an ideal state. They're using all sorts of captured trucks from France or from Czechoslovakia or whatever, which is a complete mishmash. So when they break down, you can't fix them. Out of 500,000 trucks in the German army, by mid-November, in the East, by mid-November, 150,000 were write-offs, so they're out of action, they're done. And 200,000 are in urgent need of repair. That's like more than 2/3 of your truck fleet is not happening for you. Well, they had horses, a lot of horses, but the horses are slow. The horse can pull a cart that's tiny. And so when you need to go 1,500 kilometers or 1,000 kilometers, it's going to take a long time for the horse to get that stuff there. Not to mention, you talked about food, Matthias. Horses eat more food than anybody. So you have horses to move stuff, but then you also need to take up space in your transport to feed those horses. So that also limits you. The train situation was so bad that they calculated, okay, here's the minimum number of trains a day going east that we need to just meet the army's basic needs to keep it fighting and keep it alive. In October 1941, they needed 2,200 trains a day. They were getting 1,800. And the need is the minimum, right? So no extra clothing shipments are included in this. November 1941, they need 2,150. They get 1,700. So if you are already something like 25% below your minimum, you're in a very, very serious problem, right? So, and all these reports, they keep mentioning we don't have enough trains, we don't have enough trains. So the winter clothing they had prepared sat, even many of the donations of women's fur coats or whatever didn't make it to the front in time because they did not have the transport capacity.
And of course, it's not just the trains, and you mentioned this, and because you talked about trucks as well. So you're already down on the number of trains that you have. So that all reduces everything you can push to the front line. And then you talked about the problems with the trucks, all sorts of different vehicles. They break down, you can't fix them, all these things, all these issues. And when you look at the railway network in the Soviet Union, I mean, that's not vast, that's not extensive. So you have to still move goods and troops and ammunition and winter clothing from the train stations, the railheads somewhere to the troops. And how do you normally do that? You either say, well, with horses, because the German army still has a lot of horses, so hundreds of thousands of horses joining the campaign in the East in 1941. Or, as you said, you've got the trucks, they break down, they've got problems. The other problem, of course, that you find in that part of the world is, and it's bad seasoning, you might say, for the Germans, because you've got the summer, that's quite nice, you can advance, even though there are already logistical issues there because they run out of petrol quite early on. And then we look at winter, but of course, in between, you've got this mud season, the Rasputitsa, and that is also a huge, huge problem because everything just turns into the sea of mud. You can't move. The few vehicles that you have, they basically sink in, even if you can still use them, because you have to work the engines extremely hard. They're going to be using a lot of petrol. You can't just move things from left to right, from north to south. So basically, all operations, all movement stops for quite some time. And the Germans in the Soviet Union at that stage, they're just waiting in some ways for winter to arrive because they know the ground will freeze and you can then start to move again. But of course, that also means the temperatures are going to drop even further. And if you're then dealing with all these issues that we've now mentioned, you've got a very, very bad situation. And you're absolutely right. When you look at some of these accounts from occupied Poland, for example, you can see that, well, some of these warehouses in places like Warsaw, they are full, but they just can't get that stuff to the Eastern Front. And that's the huge and big problem that they're facing.
Yep, and it's a problem that they could not overcome. It's weird sometimes. I've seen a quote sometimes from the Quartermaster General in late November saying, we're not ready for the winter. But, from August, he had prepared what he was asked to prepare. It's just by the time everyone accepts that the campaign will go through the winter with the full field army there, they're not able to then flip a switch and get the stuff there. We're talking about many, many thousands upon thousands of tons of supplies that have to go hundreds and hundreds of kilometers through this awful limited transportation network. You don't just flip a switch and say, oh, this week the Army High Command agreed that the campaign is not going to be over as planned. Now we just ship the stuff and it'll be there in a couple of days. No way, no how. This huge pipeline takes so much time to figure out and to fill.
An alternative to that would have been, of course, you might argue, just to hand out all that kit and gear to the troops as they march across the border. But then when you think about this is June 1941. It gets very, very hot in Russia. Of course, you don't give them winter equipment because you know exactly what they're going to do with it. They're just going to throw it away. So why would you? On top of that, of course, at that stage, the expectation that the campaign is going to be over very soon anyway. So there is no need to hand out all these things. So it's a big problem.
Yeah, why would you hand it out to everyone when you expect only a third of them will still be in
Exactly.
that theater when the
Exactly.
cold weather comes? So it makes no sense. Not only one last point perhaps, because I really did go on a rabbit hole thing. I even went to the semi-official German history to check some things. It's not only about winter clothing. Winter gear includes tons of other stuff. Ovens, kettles, different kinds of tents, plans on how to build barracks that can be, weather resistant out of local wood and all that sort of stuff. So there's a huge amount of other things that go along with that are also not able to be transported. So it's great if you have a winter jacket. It's better than not having one. But if you don't have kettles, don't have a sort of wood oven to make a fire. Now the German army, basically they looted anything that they could lay their hands on and needed it or felt they needed in the Soviet Union. So they took local people's winter clothing or homes or ovens or what have you, but you just can't cover the gap in that case. So
no, it's very true. And it's interesting also talking about this, about the looting and basically just moving into the local population's homes. So I was just thinking about German war films. I mean, it's another rabbit hole, and we talked about war films quite a bit. It's really interesting that when you look at these German black and white films from the 50s, 60s, probably into the 60s, where this always happens. There's always some sort of cold stuff happening, normally something to do with Stalingrad, and a unit gets kind of, well, I don't know, delayed or whatever, the train breaks down, they just get off the train, they find a house somewhere, and of course, because they're all very nice people, so they go into the house, they share the house with the Russian, normally the Russian woman who's there with the children because the husband was killed, was serving on the front line, was already killed, and they share their food and all these things. I mean, that's probably a bit of a 1950s and 60s view of the world, to be perfectly honest.
I'm sure it happened sometimes. The question always is, are they sharing because they want to be nice? Or are they sharing because they're afraid? And how often did it happen? But be that as it may, that was our answer, John, to your question about winter clothing. Thanks for asking that question because I really enjoyed looking up some of the details and I learned something from that, a few interesting stats that I had not come across before. Next question. Let's keep up with the 1941 relationship a little bit here. Quentin, or Quentin, if you're from France, had a question as well about Hitler and his no retreat orders. Hitler famously gives a few no retreat orders. Doesn't matter what it costs us, we're going to stay put, like in December 1941 in front of Moscow. And Quentin/Quentin's question is, did these no retreat orders actually succeed in stabilizing the front sometimes, or were they always, in the end, harmful to the German position? Again, Matthias, as our resident German.
Okay. Very good question. Nicely linked to the previous one. Absolutely right. I think when you hear this question, of course, this has been talked about and debated, and I think today, influenced by the lessons of the 1950s and 60s, or maybe also the memoirs that generals wrote after the war. The idea, of course, is that everything that Hitler ever ordered was bad. These orders were bad, and if the generals had just been given the free hand to do the tactics and operations as they wanted, the war would have gone very, very differently. I mean, this is the standard phrase, the standard answer that you hear. I have to admit that my personal view is a little bit different. Now I'm putting on both a military and historian's hat. And let's look at 1941 to begin with. So the winter battle in Moscow. I mean, the biggest crime and the biggest problem at the operational level here is that the Germans were trying to capture Moscow in the first place. Because when you look at the troops, they're completely exhausted. We just talked about it, the winter equipment, all these things. Even if they'd reached Moscow and seized Moscow, they wouldn't have been able to hold it. So this is all completely barking mad in the first place. But when you then get the Soviet counterattack, how do you react to this? And of course, afterwards and during the battle and afterwards, particularly after the war, a lot of generals said, oh, we should have just abandoned our positions, just withdraw, and then establish a new defensive line. We couldn't do this because Hitler didn't allow this to happen, so that's why we suffered all these casualties. That's why, in particular, all these people froze to death. We just talked about this. That's a very, very, you might say, compelling argument. I would argue it's also a false one. To be perfectly honest, that sounds quite a bit weird probably. Now, I'm much more in Hitler's camp than in the other camp when it comes to this. But just think about the situation. You're now sitting somewhere 20, 30, 50, 100 kilometers to the west of Moscow. It's winter. There is a lot of snow. You don't have winter equipment. You don't have enough tanks, and the tanks that you have sometimes are completely frozen. You can't use them. You don't have enough petrol to drive your vehicles. And even if you do have petrol, how are you going to drive all your vehicles through these 2, 3, I don't know how many meters of snow? That makes it extremely difficult. So the fear here is that should you start to withdraw, and if the Soviets learn about this, they will just basically go after you and turn the whole withdrawal into a Turkish shoot. There's nothing you can do from stopping them to run over you, over your tanks, over your positions, and just completely wipe you out. And that would have completely opened up the front line. So you might make the argument actually staying put and trying to hold them, because where you're staying now, at least you've got some sort of defensive position. This is not the Atlantic Wall. But at least you've got these guys who are staying there because they've been there for at least a couple of days, sometimes perhaps even a week or two. They've started to perhaps somebody dig in properly because the ground is frozen, but you're able to prepare some sort of defensive position. And that might give you the upper hand in the fighting there. So this is an extremely difficult one. I would say that, there's no perfect solution. Let's put it that way. In this scenario, whatever you do is probably going to be wrong. I'm thinking that actually this decision to stay put in this particular scenario was probably not wrong. I might be completely wrong. Jesse, what do you think?
No, I think it's interesting because I, in my mind, would differentiate between the December 1941 no retreat order and some of the later war no retreat orders.
Coming to that in a minute, yes.
Yeah, okay. There's a big difference there. I won't get too ahead of ourselves here, but withdrawing in good order is while fighting, like a fighting retreat in good order, is a very, very difficult thing to pull off. It's a lot more difficult than sometimes, and risky sometimes, than just staying put, accepting whatever losses you're going to take, but being able to maintain the cohesion of your army, not allowing the enemy to catch you in a very vulnerable moment of trying to move back and of trying to retreat. This is why often in history you have stories about, well, this army was retreating, but then they stopped, or then they sent a rear guard that sacrificed itself to hold off the enemy. It's because you can't very easily fight and retreat at the same time without getting yourself destroyed. And so I tend to think that, yes, the no retreat order in December 41 probably did help prevent a worse disaster from the German point of view, but that then as the war went on, these no retreat orders became more and more for the political symbolism, the ideological principle, and they didn't serve a military purpose, as awful as that military decision was in 41. So you have whatever Festung Breslau and other towns where you just have big garrisons essentially accepting that they're going to be surrounded. You can say that they distract some Soviet troops, but there were so many of them. The Kurland pocket is another big story of they could have withdrawn and they didn't, and they had a couple 100,000 men there. Matthias, you know those stories better than I, but that's how I see some of those later war situations.
Yeah, I think it becomes a desperate measure. It becomes one solution fits all. So just stay put, just fight and die. I mean, I nearly said silly there, but I don't think that really is the right and appropriate term. But yes, it is. It's when you get to that stage and you say that's the only solution we got to everything. That's not particularly clever. I mean, coming back to the previous point you made about the fighting withdrawal, it is true that the fighting withdrawal is seen normally as one of the most difficult operations that military commanders can carry out or might have to carry out. And then coming back to what you said about 1941, in a situation like this, with the other factors around like snow, what have you, very, very, very difficult. 1944, 1945, absolutely right. I mean, it becomes a different story. It just becomes, as I said, I nearly said silly here, but if the one-stop solution for every problem, that's not really going to help. And when you look at the consequence, I mean, you just go at the casualty rates that go up like crazy in the particular period. Also, of course, because the guys who get in now in the German military, these half-trained recruits, they're no longer the battle-hardened veterans. They don't know what they're doing. They basically just get killed. But it's also that particular type of fighting because you tend to write them off, these people in these fortresses, as they call them. Having said that, when you take a step back again and you look at the general concept of these fortresses, because everything becomes a fortress now. Wherever you go, everything's a fortress. And everything needs to be held to either the last man or the last round, which might sound very, very similar to people, but it's fundamentally different. Because last round means once you're done and you surrender. Last man, you don't surrender. So that's quite an important difference. There might be times where doing this and declaring places fortresses might actually make military sense. If you go to the Eastern Front and you look at what goes on from 1943 onwards, in particular 1944 onwards, so Bagration, the operation that we have talked about. So you know that you're now facing, if you're German, you're facing a Red Army which is far more mobile than you are, because the Germans have lost most of their tanks. They're basically walking everywhere. It's a very, very slow army. It's a First World War army in many, many ways. We need to move away from this idea that everyone's driving around in a Tiger tank. That does not happen. That is not the army. And you know that you can potentially be outmaneuvered by these mechanized and armored corps and armies. And that's a problem because you simply can't get away quickly enough. So having a fortified place or fortress somewhere, use them as a wave breaker, so basically a bulwark against the forces, that might actually work. And then you fix the enemy forces there. But what you then need to do, and this is where the whole concept then falls flat on a spot. If you just do this, this is not going to work. What you would then need is an extra formation, an extra part of the troops who would then counterattack. If you do it that way, then it makes perfect sense to have this idea of all these fortresses. And when you look at the original German concept and the original German planning in that particular period, this is exactly what they're trying to do. They're trying to have these fortified places. They would then bring in the ever-shrinking number of very mobile forces, so tank corps and all these things, the fire brigades on the Eastern Front, and they would just be sent from one point of fighting to the next, trying to relieve these fortresses, and by doing that, inflict very heavy casualties on the enemy. However, if you haven't got that second part, or not enough of these because you simply don't have enough tanks to go around, then of course the concept falls completely flat on its face, and it's basically all you're doing is you're basically just pushing to the right on the time axis, well, the inevitable, and by that making sure that you suffer, just like the other side, suffer an awful lot of casualties on the way.
Yeah, I think once again, we're talking about intentions versus means and the clash between the two, whether it's winter supplies in 41 or the idea of how to fight in conjunction with a fortified place later in the war. I don't have much else to chip in for that one. Matthias, was that
No, I
your
think
nugget
that's...
of... Okay, that was your nugget of wisdom for the no retreat orders. Thanks for that question. I think we'll move on to our next supporter question, which is from Fabio. And Fabio asked about neutrals, which I think is an interesting topic that we haven't talked about very much on the podcast, despite having done this 100 times now. And Fabio, it's a good enough idea that we could probably do a couple of episodes on neutrals at some point in our next 100 episodes. But he sent a list of a couple that he was interested in. One of them was Portugal. So I went and learned a little bit more than I knew before about Portugal as a neutral in the Second World War. Maybe I get the ball rolling for us, Matthias, and then you can come in and share your contribution about Portugal. So one of the interesting things about Portugal is if we assume that not all of you, listeners and viewers, are experts in the situation in Portugal at the start of World War II, it's an interesting place. It is run by a dictator some of you may have heard of because he's going to run Portugal until the 1970s, Antonio Salazar. He's an authoritarian, nationalist, pretty much dictator. But they have an alliance with the UK. And they've had this alliance with the UK since the Middle Ages for something like 500 years. So you'd think, well, they're being pulled in two directions, right? They have a kind of government that maybe has something in common with Franco's Spain and Mussolini's Italy and Germany and so forth, but they have an alliance, a very old one, but an alliance that was honored in the First World War, because Portugal does fight in the First World War. They send a couple of infantry divisions to the Western Front. That doesn't go well, since those infantry divisions get absolutely stomped in 1918, in spring 1918, the poor guys. So, much to Portugal's relief, I imagine, the UK does not ask them to join. So they're not obligated to join the war just because of this alliance. The UK had to sort of activate it, which they don't. So, oh yes, of course, if you're Portugal, you still have an empire. And you got to worry that if you join the war, you're never going to be able to defend that empire. You've got Angola, you've got Mozambique, you've got some very important islands, strategically important islands in the Atlantic, Madeira and the Azores. And then there's even Goa over in India. So if you're Portugal, you're in this kind of weird situation. It makes sense for you not to get involved. Did I miss something in the general situation there, Matthias?
No, I think that makes absolute sense. I think you nailed it.
Lovely. Then I want to talk more about the islands, because this is one of those flashpoints that everyone's interested in, the islands in the Atlantic. The Germans have some plans. The Allies really covet them. Why? Because you can base things there for the Battle of the Atlantic. So the Americans and British are very interested in basing aircraft there so they can fly and cover some of the gaps in the middle of the Atlantic with air cover to find submarines. In 1943, the Portuguese agreed to lease some bases to the UK. So the Brits can then start flying some planes out of there. In 1944, they then get a similar agreement with the Americans. So they kind of let the Allies use a part of their territory for military bases, which means you're not maybe, purely neutral at that point. You're maybe technically a non-belligerent, something along those lines. Interestingly, the US used their base, among other things, to refuel airships, so like Zeppelin-style airships, that were going to an American base, this is after 1942, in Morocco, to take anti-submarine duties out of Morocco, which I have to say, I did not know that there was a US airship refueling base on the Azores Islands in World War II. That's for all the trivia people out there, on your next World War II pub quiz, that's a question you've got to be in there. The Germans also had some plans to invade Portugal or seize the islands once they defeated the USSR in order to better fight against Britain. But of course, then they don't act on those because they never defeat the USSR.
The whole thing about the Air Force, of course, that's the key thing here, isn't it, really? Because that closes the mid-Atlantic gap. So you put planes onto the Azores and you basically just covered most of the Atlantic. And of course, that has an impact on the German U-boats, in addition to Enigma and all these things. But you can now actually start to hunt these U-boats in this mid-Atlantic, which before that you were not able to do at all. So that's, I think, from a pure military point of view and strategic point of view, that's probably the most important contribution. There are others. There's raw materials, Wolfram, which they sell to both the Germans and the Allies. And of course, the Allies are putting more and more pressure onto Portugal as the war continues and progresses. And of course, everyone can see the war's not going in Germany's favor. So this is the reason why from 1942, you talked about 1943 onwards, they're moving more, let's put it that way, towards the Allied camp. Not joining the war, but yes, leaning more towards the Allies. And I think that is pretty obvious and pretty clear. It's also interesting when you look at Spain. I mean, technically another neutral country, which I think we should also do in a mini-series or a proper series, the Spanish Civil War and the Spanish actions during World War II. But just linking it now to the Portuguese case, it's interesting because the Germans had these plans for not an invasion of Spain, because they were more or less allied with the Spanish and Franco, but they were drawing up these plans for Operation Felix, so the attack on Gibraltar and seize Gibraltar, which of course again never happened because they couldn't win over Franco and he wouldn't open the doors to let the Germans in. But when you look at the operational plan, it's quite interesting because they would have had one corps that went straight down to Gibraltar from Madrid. to attack Gibraltar. They would also have a very, very strong covering and blocking force in the west, to the west of Madrid, because the Germans were thinking that should they do something like this, and should someone realize that German troops are in Spain, that would set a wheel in motion in which the Allies would land troops in Portugal and would then counterattack the Germans in Spain through Portugal. So again, you can see how all this is beginning to grow even bigger. And of course, the British-Portuguese alliance, the traditional one that you mentioned, plays a role here as well. So it was on people's radars, even though it sits just over there, doesn't it? You can't get further away from the Eastern Front than Portugal, but it still does play a role in people's thinking.
Geez, that counterfactual or hypothetical situation of the Germans coming into Spain and the Brits coming into Portugal, it's flashing 1808 into my mind here, with the Germans replacing Napoleonic French forces and the Brits and Portuguese fighting on that side of the Iberian Peninsula. Not to forget Portugal's Asian colonies. They do have a presence there as well. They have East Timor, for example, which the Allies are worried once the war breaks out with Japan. The Allies are worried that the Japanese will grab it because it's in a geographically useful position to project force in that part of the world around Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Australia, that theater. So Australian and Dutch troops, not a combination we talk about that often on the podcast so far. Australian and Dutch troops seize and occupy East Timor. So they essentially violate Portuguese neutrality, as the Allies did in Iceland, for example. And Salazar's not happy. He's pretty angry. I mean, someone just shows up with troops and takes one of your colonies. I mean, they might say it's temporary and it's for its own protection, but, if you didn't accept that, you're not happy. So he ships off a battalion to go and replace them. But before that battalion can get there, it's pretty far from Portugal, the Japanese take it. And so then it's a moot point from there on. The other interesting point for Portugal in Asia is Goa, right? This Indian port city that Portugal's had for centuries, part of this trading stuff. And at the beginning of the war, some German commercial ships flee to neutral ports, right? So that the British can't get them. And some German ships then go into the safety of the port at Goa. But while they're there, they are transmitting. There's this one particular German ship that's making radio transmissions to the home base that's giving intelligence on Allied ship movements that can be observed from Goa's port. So the British send in some special forces. They sink that German ship that's sending the radio signals, violating Portuguese neutrality, but they end those radio transmissions of the German intel. And that operation, as far as I can tell from what I read, was not public until 1978. So a long-lasting secret of the British Special Forces action in the port, in the harbor at Goa, which I had no idea about. So thank you, Fabio, for asking this question. It gave me some serious ammunition for World War II trivia, that's for sure. Matthias, you also mentioned Wolfram, which is also called tungsten. And this is an important raw material for manufacturing ammunition in particular. They sell it to both sides. They try to set a quota where they basically say, we're going to sell an equal amount to both sides, and then we're still neutral. We can't be seen to be supporting one side or the other. The US and UK pile on the pressure in 1944. So Portugal says, okay, you don't want us to sell to the Germans? We won't. But we won't sell to you either. And they suffer economically for that, but that was their decision. And finally, if I may, because I also got into the Portugal rabbit hole here, people.
Absolutely.
Finally, diplomatically, Portugal plays an interesting role because it's one of the escape routes for refugees and political exiles or what have you fleeing from Europe. By some estimates, up to 1 million people flee German-occupied Europe through Portugal during the war. A couple of famous people as well. like the French pilot and author Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. After 1940, France is defeated. He gets eventually to North America, but he goes there through Portugal. And quite a few aristocrats, members of various royal houses and things, they end up going into exile during the war in Portugal. One of them is Umberto II, the last king of Italy, because in 1946, he tries to become king of Italy, doesn't work out. So he flees to Portugal, a bit of a echo of Portugal's role in World War II. But not only famous people, of course. Portuguese diplomats, quite a few of them, I guess, used and abused their position to help people in different countries. Different ambassadors were giving visas, even when it sometimes went against the official instructions from Portugal. They gave visas to people to allow them to escape, especially people from France were the biggest group of refugees, but also some Jews, especially from Hungary. The ambassador there was giving out all sorts of visas to Hungarian Jews to go to Portugal. He was then recognized by the Yad Vashem in Israel as one of the righteous among the nations. That's the designation they have for people who really went out of their way to help European Jews during the war. The island of Madeira took about 2,500 refugees from Gibraltar in 1940 when the Brits moved some civilians out of Gibraltar. Last point I have on Portugal is espionage. Because any neutral country in the middle of a warring continent, you're going to have some spying going here and there. There's a famous British double agent in the war called Garbo. And he was working for the Germans, and he switches to the British and feeds the Germans false information from his base in Portugal for a time. And a story I didn't know before answering this question was an American, William Colpa, defected when his ship came into port in Lisbon, commercial ship, merchant vessel. He defects, he goes to the Germans and says, I want to spy for you. So the Germans send him over in a U-boat, land him on the coast of Maine, and he was supposed to then do some espionage for the Germans, but he get caught right away and arrested. So there's another trivia question for you folks. William Colpa. That's all I got on Portugal, everybody. That was the entire sum of my worldly knowledge about Portugal in the Second World War. Don't ask me for any more.
Well, that was more than I know about Portugal, I have to say. So there we are. There we go. I mean, it is really interesting, this refugee thing as well, because as you were talking, I was just thinking about the long history of people going into Portugal or going away from Portugal as refugees. And there are so many examples, even slightly before the Second World War. Again, look at the Spanish situation, so the Spanish royal family, a lot of the Spanish generals who had to go into exile before Franco takes over, they all come from there. So from Portugal, because that's where in exile, that's interesting. And of course, Portugal itself has a bit of a history, you might say, of all of this, because you mentioned Napoleon invading earlier. So when he invades, the entire court from Lisbon, well, packs up, jumps on a ship, and goes to Brazil. So there's a bit of a long-standing history. That it's quite interesting, because you quite often think, well, it's this teeny tiny country out there. As I said, you can't get any further west. It's really not important. But when you look at the links it has, the links it establishes, mainly in this diplomatic world, the question of refugees, and also economics, and then also the pure military side of things, as we said, the islands, which the Allies can use as air bases. It's absolutely fascinating. It's a very, very important place. Another place, if we want to jump to one other country very briefly, again, we probably have to do a number of episodes on this, but just because I was thinking about this as we're talking about planes, a country that kind of fits the bill as well. I mean, that's now a very broad brush, of course, is Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, where in the West, the Allies get air bases, again, making sure that they can send the planes out to the Atlantic to hunt German U-boats. And of course, they get weather stations there. And this is very important, for example, for 6th of June, for D-Day, because they've got weather stations there. The Germans don't. So the British weather forecast is far more detailed than the German one. But I digress. That's Ireland. That's a different story. Again, probably one we should do a whole episode on, but it just triggered the thought as you were talking.
Absolutely. Right. I think we have time for one more question for this episode. And I think I'm going to go back to a second question from Quentin or Quentin, because he asked several bangers, several really good questions. So good on you, Quentin, for giving us such awesome stuff here. He asked about commanders, German commanders. He says, were German commanders genuinely constrained by Hitler, or did they often agree with his strategic direction? This is a theme that you've spoken to, Matthias, in passing, including earlier in this episode, many times, this relationship between the German generals and Hitler, especially with what the German generals then said was their relationship with Hitler after the war. So why don't you take it away?
This is a big one. So this could take forever. So let's try to keep it as short as possible, which we all know is a big challenge, isn't it? It's a challenge.
Of course.
The relationship between Hitler and his generals shifts and changes quite drastically during the war. So in the early stages, and that is France, Poland, so basic early stages of the Soviet Union, he at least leaves the operational planning very much to the generals. So maybe we need to talk a little bit about this. I'm not quite sure if all the listeners and viewers are familiar with this, the different levels of war. In a nutshell, you've got the tactical level. This is where the fighting happens. This is what most people look at. This is what most films deal with, because that's where shells explode and people get killed. You then have the operational level. This is where you use formations, corps and armies to move around, to move into someone else's territory, trying to outmaneuver and circle forces, things like this. This is the level where you win battles, and by that you win campaigns, and that can then potentially lead to winning the war. And then you've got the strategic level, which is divided into two. The military strategic level, which is how do you organize the military in order to be able to fight these things, and also how do you then support the political level? That's political strategy. This is where you set the policy aims. What is it that you want to achieve with this particular war? And Hitler, as the supreme commander of the army, also as the Führer, which combines the political and the military leadership, you might say controls the political and military strategy. That's what he does. The situation then changes quite drastically in 1941, after the battles in the East, where he sacks lots of generals and he makes himself commander of the army as well. Which you might say sounds a bit strange, but the army, of course, is the most important service in the German military. The supreme command of the army is responsible for fighting the war in the East, so that comes under the army. So he's now control of this, which basically means he's moving from a strategic command who just sets out the perimeter, says, I want you to, whatever, conquer France, conquer Russia, and then leaves the planning to the military, which he did in the early stages. He's now beginning to interfere ever more, because he thinks, particularly after 1941, that his generals are actually not as good as he thought they were, and because he won, he says he won in France and he won in Poland and all these campaigns up to that, he knows how to do these things. And you can see that as the war progresses, and this is now a very, very broad brush to a very, very complex story, that he's beginning to interfere more and more and more and more, because he trusts his generals less and less. And that takes it to the extreme when he's then sitting in the bunker in 1945. He's sometimes even looking at really small tactical units, and he orders them around on this map in Berlin, because this is what he wants to do. So there is an increase in this control. On the other hand, I think it's still fair to say that definitely at the tactical level, to a degree at the operation level as well, all the way to the end, the generals probably had more freedom, and the commanders on the ground more freedom than after the war they would admit to. Because it was very, very simple to simply state, no, we want to do things very differently. It was Hitler's fault. He told us to do this. He told us to establish these fortified places, these fortresses, to just stand and die, all these things, and things that we've talked about as well. And so he becomes the scapegoat. And of course, he's dead. So that's very easy to do. But when you look at the interactions between Hitler and the generals, yes, he gets more, the long screwdriver comes up more and more. But just blaming Hitler for all of this, I think, is too easy, and it's just the easy way out and the easy ticket out by generals who, after the war, just wanted to write their own stories, their memoirs, and obviously present themselves in a very good light.
Yeah, and I think early in the war, you might even flip the question on its head and say the German commanders were trying to constrain Hitler because they were worried that his plans for attacking Poland and then for attacking France were too ambitious, were too risky, given what they assessed the capabilities of the army to be. After that, it's a little harder to try to constrain Hitler after the victory over France because he has a lot more sort of, let's say, credibility than, at least even in perception. So, yeah, I think you're the expert on this question much more than me. My impression is, yeah, it's a lot murkier than what the surviving generals who then spoke to the Americans after the war would have us believe.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So are you satisfied with that? Geez, so that was a very, very concise answer on
That was
a
extremely
German
concise,
command
wasn't it?
topic. I'm
Because otherwise
impressed.
I could turn this into a 15 episode one if you wanted me to, but there we are.
Right. In that case, folks, we will wrap up this, our 100th episode of Both Sides of the Wire. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Thanks especially to our supporters who provided the questions for today. We couldn't get to all the questions that were sent to us. We will try to have another question answering episode in the foreseeable future so we can answer some more of them. If you liked what you heard today, or if you have a question that you want to submit to us so that we might be able to answer it on an episode, you can become a supporter of the podcast. You can do that by going to bothsidesofthewire.com. We'd be happy to have you there. You get access to exclusive content in our war room. You can try that out for free by using the code DeepDarkWoods. And you can submit us questions that we might answer on another episode just like this one. So once again, thanks to everybody for helping us get to 100 episodes. And we'll see you in episode 101. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.